Hi, welcome to my office. Voila, a little different from the castle background. So I wanted to talk about the metaphysical poets. We don't have a lot of time with them, but we do have this week. And primarily we're looking at, of course, John Donne, as well as a couple works by Andrew Marvell. So what is a metaphysical poet, right? I want to read to you from the Handbook to Literature, Harman's work. The characteristics of the best metaphysical poetry are logical elements in a technique intended to express honestly, if unconventionally, the poet's sense of life's complexities. The poetry is intellectual, analytical, psychological, disillusioning, bold, absorbed in thoughts of death, physical love, religious devotion. The diction is relatively simple and may echo common speech. The imagery is drawn from the commonplace or the remote, actual life or erudite sources, the figure itself often being elaborated with self-conscious ingenuity. The form is frequently that of an argument. Okay, a lot there. Especially with John Donne, we look at what are called conceits. Okay, conceits. And a conceit is basically an extended or very elaborate metaphor, right? A sustained metaphor. You can look at maybe a compass. Not the kind where the thing goes to the north, but the kind you have in drawing classes, right? Where you have the two legs in the center point, and it can open and close. And what Donne does, and what the metaphysical poets in general try to do, is work this conceit, and through it show a sense of understanding, typically of love, sexual love often, right? Physical, but also spiritual, but still maybe more of a greater emphasis on physical love than maybe we're used to seeing in some of the other poetry. And the idea that this conceit reveals or exposes or enlightens us in some way about the very nature of this love and attraction. Okay? John Donne is in some ways a tale of two different lives. There's the young Donne, and then there's the older Donne. The rake and the respectable guy, right? So the young man, right, who's, how should I put this, a little irresponsible, right? I mean, you gotta admit, right, he does a few things that you might say, really? Not a good move, buddy. He's raised Catholic in a time when in England the Roman Catholics are vilified. They're not allowed into the higher levels of government or education. The avenues for financial success are largely closed off. And it gets worse, of course, because at this point in time now, and we're talking about in the late 16th and early 17th century, is basically seen that Catholics are in many ways traitors to the country because they don't, they don't follow the Church of England, right? In the same way, also dissenters were looked upon too. But at first, of course, it was largely Catholics who suffered the brunt of a lot of prejudice and discrimination in this time. And Donne's family And if you read the notes in the textbook, right, you can read about John Donne's family and essentially how poorly they were treated. It really came to the point where John Donne had to convert if he was going to have any kind of life whatsoever in progress in the way that he wanted to. And so he converts to the Church of England. And even later, that conversion is a little fuzzy at first, but later he is, again, essentially put in a position where he has to not only convert, but also show hostility to the church that he was raised in. Eventually, James rewards him with a very prominent deanship at St. Paul's. Even to this day, right, St. Paul's is perhaps the most famous church, physical church in England. I mean, it's in Mary Poppins after all. So, when he writes, okay, Donne is essentially reinventing the different genres like love and the topics of poetry, but he's also reworking the symbols. And he takes, as I said, ordinary or often everyday kind of things, even a teardrop, which of course is already, let's say, symbolically charged, but he looks at it in a whole new way, right? So while a compass is certainly not something that has a long, rich tradition in love poetry, tears certainly may be said to. And yet Donne reworks everything. Okay, he reworks everything. Much of what he does is termed a dramatic monologue. Now, those of you who were fortunate enough to take English 216 may remember dramatic monologue from our discussion of the poetry of Robert Browning. In dramatic monologue, a monologue is a person talking, typically to an unseen listener, another character. And the speaker is a quote-unquote character, not the poet, him or herself. Okay, the voice, if you will, is of a distinctive character experiencing something and explaining this to somebody else, right? Hence the term dramatic monologue. Right? Don't confuse that directly with the person of the poet. A mistake that happens a lot, right? So when we examine the poetry of John Donne, these are the kind of things I want you to be thinking of. What is the central conceit? What is that metaphor? And how does he work it? Right? How does he work it to reveal something that isn't really normally thought of or expected with this particular metaphor? Okay. A lot of what's happening, to be blunt about it, is we have these divisions of spiritual love and physical love, and kind of bringing that together in many ways, right? The interchange of the erotic and the spiritual is largely unavoidable in John Donne. Now, also, this week we're taking on two works by Andrew Marvell. And, after John Donne, he's probably, arguably the second most famous poet of this collection, this group. He is significantly younger than Donne. That is to say, he was born, about 50 years after Donne. Okay, so they're two generations apart. And so while certainly the poetry of Donne influences Marvell, we wouldn't necessarily say they're the same group of poets, like in the same way that when we look at William Wordsworth and Keats and Byron and Shelley from the Romantics, where there is a much tighter grouping of people by age and really only William Blake stands out as, again, significantly outside of that generation. Marvell is, like I said, 50 years younger, right? So, they're not going to have a lot together. But Marvell is, however, obviously influenced. Now, one of the things, again, about the poetry of Marvell, is the dynamic of what your book calls the dichotomy, the breaking up into two parts of things that are opposites, or at least perceived to be opposites, and putting them together. Marvell is kind of interesting in his poetry. He leans heavily on couplets, rhymed couplets, where you have A, B, B, C, C. But unlike what we're going to see in the very near future, he doesn't use the iambic pentameter line. He uses iambic tetrameter, meaning 4. Okay, 4 feet. Iambic meaning soft hard, right? That's the traditional English meter, soft hard, right? The iambic. But it's more common for poets to write in pentameter, where they have 5 of these feet in a single line. And you see this, for instance, in John Milton, although Milton did not write couplets. In fact, when we look at Milton next week, we'll see how he argues against the use of rhyming. But Marvell does rhyme. He has these couplets. So what couplets do is they form little units. Okay, so when you have the A, B, B, C, C rhyme, right, it holds things together a little bit. It also creates certain levels of expectation. When you know there's a word that's got to be rhymed, it's almost like you can anticipate what the next word may be. Nevertheless, and I don't mean to make it sound like it's simplistic poetry. That's just the meter and the rhyme. The content of the poetry is much more complicated than I think a lot of readers realize. So, for instance, To His Coy Mistress, which arguably may be one of the most famous poems of this whole course that wasn't written by Shakespeare, right? It's in some ways simple enough to be read in high school, right? So that's why I say if you've come across any of this poetry, in all likelihood it wasn't done. It was this, Marvell's To His Coy Mistress. And yet, again, there are, as I said, opposites, dichotomies, things that are sitting here and here, outside of my screen, right, that somehow need to be resolved. And what's interesting, again, is to look at how this resolution happens. Spiritual love and erotic love, for example, right? The theme, and this is a well-known theme, of carpe diem, right? And we all, of course, know from our high school Latin that means seize the day, right? Carpe diem, we got to go for it now, Don't wait for tomorrow. Don't put off for tomorrow, because who knows what tomorrow may bring. Life is short. You got to do today, kind of thing, right? Which in many ways works against a lot of spiritual teaching and understanding. And I'm talking here, obviously, clearly within the Christian tradition of the Protestant Church. But that idea of, you have pleasure, sexual earthly pleasure, right in front of you. And then this other thing, which is supposed to be a devotional thing, which, for 2,000 years has been in contrast to that, is something that is hard to necessarily resolve. And yet that's what these poems are in many ways trying to do, right? So the first reading of To His Coy Mistress may be saying, oh yeah, he just wants to have sex with his girlfriend. Right? I mean, that's all there is to it. He being the speaker. But look at it a little bit more carefully and see what you see is really coming through. And of course, we also have the dialogue to look at as well, right? Between the soul and the body. Couldn't say it any better.